Still standing, thank Arceus. Just take all of your Pokémon and lead the Tentacruel and Tentacool down that way and we'll meet up with you. Jenny instructed. Ash nodded and then watched as Officer Jenny retreated towards the panic shelters so she could get Nurse Joy. Ash then addressed his friends. Well guys. We've got a lot of work ahead of us that will surely take some time. You okay with that? Of course Ash. We're in everything together so that means we stand by you. Misty answered. We're not afraid of some hard work Ash. We're with you. Brock agreed. Giselle just looked coy. Give me another kiss and I'll tell you my answer. She told him. Ash grinned stupidly and wrapped his arms around her waist as he kissed her deeply. She placed her beautiful long fingers, adorned with red nail polish, on his face and kissed him back fiercely. When they finished, Giselle looked dazed. She suddenly snapped out of it and pumped her fist in the air. Damn straight, all help. Now let's go fix us some reefs. She shouted as she hopped up in the air. Misty just watched Giselle's afterglow excitement from the kiss with envy and Brock just snickered. Ash chuckled and laced his fingers into her own. Okay sweetie, just calm down. He said with humor in his voice. He looked back up at Tentacruel. Just follow us to the Pokémon Center Tentacruel. He directed. The giant nodded and then rallied its kin together behind it as Ash led them all through the torn-up city and towards the Pokémon Center. As the kids, the giant Tentacruel and the large mass of the other Tentacool and Tentacruel slowly began disappearing further into the city, the three Rocket members who had been cowering behind a large slab of concrete near a mostly destroyed building, poked their heads out and looked around. Well, it's finally over. James observed as he looked around at the now empty section of city they were in. And we didn't get hurt or blasted off one time. Jessie said gleefully. Not to mention that wicked old witch Nastina got her just deserves too. It must be our lucky day. James mirrored her excitement as he looked at her with shining eyes. Jessie suddenly looked serious as she raised a finger. We should probably get out of this city before the twerps come across again or even worse, the cops. She said fearfully. James nodded his head vigorously. Good plan Jessie, let's go. He agreed. The two of them stood up and looked around before preparing to take off. Jessie looked down at Meowth, who was still sitting down next to the concrete slab looking as thoughtful as he had the entire time of the battle. Are you coming Meowth? She demanded impatiently. Meowth suddenly snapped out of his stupor. Wah? He asked looking around frantically. Jessie looked surprised. Calm down Meowth. I was only telling you to hurry up and come with us already. We're getting out of the city before the police or anybody else finds out who we are. Meowth still looked kind of out of it, and James was concerned. Say, are you feeling okay Meowth? You didn't get hurt in that fall, did you? He asked. Meowth took a minute to register James's words before shaking his head. Course not. I'm totally fine you guys, now let's get out of here. He said standing up. Jessie and James just shared a questioning look with each other and then shrugged. Whatever Meowth, let's just go already. Jessie pressed as she started walking away, looking every which to make sure they weren't spotted. James followed and Meowth hesitated for a minute. His mind kept flashing back to when Ash risked his own well-being just to save Meowth's life. It still completely baffled him and he couldn't understand it at all. He shook his head again. I gotta get dat out of my head. Twerp's just a softie that'll help anybody he sees in trouble. Pathetic. He said aloud as he tried to convince himself that his own words were true. Da only ting dat matters is stealing dat Pikachu and climbing da ranks of Team Rocket until I'm head cat again and replaced dat filthy Persian dat da boss is so fond of. He said with his fists clenched and a look of determination on his face. Suddenly, Meowth's gaze softened and his arms hung limply at his sides as he hung his head. Maybe. Just maybe. After I accomplish all that, she'll want me din and I can finally go back and win her over. He said softly, in barely a whisper. He snapped back to reality when he heard Jessie and James calling back for him impatiently. He shook his again and took off after them. I'll find a way to become good enough for her. I won't stop till she sees how much I care for her and finally get her to love me back. Even if I gotta end up fightin' him, I'll do it. Anything for her. Meowth let a stern and focused look come across his face as he ran faster. The talking Pokémon had a goal and he was just reminded of what it was. He was fighting and doing everything he did for her. He had forgotten that for a time, but maybe the twerp had somehow helped him remember today. Either way, Meowth was focused again and ready to make his dream come true. No matter what it cost him. XXXXXXXXXXXXXXX. Time skip. 2 months later. Ash stood on top of a large stage that was set up right near the docks in the harbor, overlooking the coral reefs that was now devoid of any kind of human structure. Giselle stood on his left with her arm wrapped around his, leaning into him slightly, while Misty stood at his right and Brock beside her. There were several other people on the stage as well. Mostly political figureheads of the city, like council members, business owners, a few officers from the Hutber Port Police Department, including Officer Jenny, and at the front of the stage, standing up on a podium that held a microphone, was the mayor of the city. A short, stocky man wearing a gray business suit with graying hair on his head and an equally as grayed beard. Out in front of the stage, stretching back into the city itself, was nearly every citizen of Hutber Port. The completely repaired city was set in the background with its repaired buildings standing tall and proud. The most interesting sight, however, was the large mass of Tentacruel, and even a few Goldeen, Seeking, Horsey and other water Pokémon that lived in the Hutber coral reefs, all crowded out in the waters of the harbor as they watched the event take place as well. Also present and standing tall, well, actually towering over the entire harbor and casting its massive shadow over the city in front of it, was the giant Tentacruel in all of its colossal glory. Standing just behind Ash and his friends behind the stage. The mayor was currently addressing the gathered population of the city, and while he did that, Ash reflected on everything that happened over the last 2 months. The first thing Ash and his friends did was start to work on restoring the coral reefs that had all but been destroyed by Nastina during the construction of her condos. The reefs were definitely in a sorry state, and Ash knew that it would take his friends and the Pokémon that lived in the reefs forever to fix the damage done to it. Luckily, however, Officer Jenny had told the mayor and city council the truth and reason behind the Tentacruel's attack on them. After providing the evidence that Ash and his friends had collected to the council and mayor, they instantly understood the reasoning behind what happened and jointly agreed to not only pardon the Pokémon from the attack but also to help build the reef back however they could and with whatever resources the city could provide. After the mayor had explained all of this to the city's population later on, every single person also agreed to help right the wrongs of their now most hated person, Nastina, however they could. So, surprisingly enough, and to the shock of the Tentacruel, and every other Pokémon that lived in the reefs, the entire population of Hutber citizens put a hold on repairing the city so they could help fix the damage done to the reefs. With Ash, his friends, the police force, nearly every person in the city, and even the help of a marine biologist who lived and researched in Hutber Port, the reefs were totally restored back to the way they looked before Nastina got her filthy hands on them in just 1 month of hard work. Much to every Pokémon that lived in the reef's utter joy and jubilation. The hardest and longest part had only been cleaning up the remains of the construction site that rested over top of the reefs before they were destroyed. They all had to be very thorough when cleaning up and had to be sure to get every piece of debris out of the water so that none of the Pokémon were injured by any of it. The secret weapon of healing the reef, however, lay in the special, completely safe for use around Pokémon chemical compound that the marine biologist was able to create after studying the reef's makeup and all of the different underwater vegetation it grew there. The compound was dumped in the water from barrels that were driven out by speedboats, and essentially, it just sped up the regrowth of the reef's vegetation that the Pokémon lived in, around and fed off of. Tentacruel was very nervous and agitated when it saw the people dump barrels of chemicals into the water. It was remembering its experience with Jessie, James and Meowth and the chemical they used which turned it into its giant form in the first place. However, with Ash sitting on top of its head, gently rubbing it and speaking soothingly to the Pokémon how the chemicals wasn't going to hurt it or any of the Pokémon in the reefs and was only supposed to help. Tentacruel calmed down. After the reefs had been totally restored and the Pokémon were living in them happily again, the humans, Ash and his friends started the repairs on the city. The work that had lain before them was very daunting to say the least since much of the city had been destroyed in the attack. However, what had surprised Ash, his friends and everyone else beyond all reasoning is when the giant Tentacruel, followed by all of the Tentacool and Tentacruel, began helping them all rebuild the city. They had just started separating off into different groups and began helping with everything that needed to be done. After the initial complete and utter shock of why the Pokémon were helping the way they were, Ash and everyone started pitching in as well and the repairs to the city were literally done in record time. Of course, with thousands of people, Ash, his friends, all of their Pokémon and the dozens of Tentacruel, Tentacool and giant Tentacruel itself all working together, you couldn't really expect anything less. Another huge event that had taken place was the trial of Nastina. Since she literally had committed crimes both nationally and internationally with her dealings with major criminal organizations like the KBR. Nastina had been shipped to and tried by the Supreme Court of Kanto, which resided in Indigo City, located on the Indigo Plateau where the Pokémon Indigo Conference was held. During the trial, several large computer monitors had been set up in the massive courtroom and on them were the live images of several political figureheads from other regions like Johto and Hoenn, which were all regions that Nastina had been a part of crimes against in some way or another. These people were there in video form to help decide in Nastina's sentencing since it was technically an inter-regional affair. The trial had been absolutely bloody and ruthless, with no mercy shown to Nastina whatsoever. Not only did they all have the evidence that Ash and his friends had presented them with but also, the police in Hutber Port had went through the remains of the Watercrown Hotel, looking for anything extra they could use in Nastina's trial. Arceus had been very good to them as well. Amazingly enough, the many filing cabinets, which were all fireproof and very resilient, and even Nastina's extremely hardy oakwood desk which contained her very incriminating laptop inside, had all miraculously survived the destruction. With all of the mountains of evidence that was obtained that day, plus the evidence collected by Ash and the others, the courts were absolutely disgusted and enraged by the crimes that Nastina had committed. Which were honestly too numerous to even count. They had all ended up on a joint agreement of a triple life sentence with no chance of parole at Deadheat Prison for the dastardly woman. Nastina had also been absolutely broken, financially, by the courts as well, who had demanded she pay even more than what she was worth for the massive damages she had caused nearly worldwide. Needless to say, Nastina was drug out of the courtrooms a broken and furious woman. Something that Ash and his friends had been ecstatic to hear about. Another huge thing that had happened was the purge of the KBR. Which happened sometime after all of the evidence from the demolished Watercrown had been collected. The information concerning the organization had been spread out to every police station in Kanto and then one by one, each hideout, HQ, crony, thug and even the leader Alton had been taken down by sheer and brunt police force. Alton had literally been taken down as in he tried fiercely to resist arrest. Which led to his, on-the-spot termination, by a furious officer Jenny and a particularly nasty Growlithe. The KBR trials had been massive and were held in the same place as Nastina's was. Each and every one of them had been sentenced to life, or multiple life sentences, with no chance of parole at Deadheat. Life at Deadheat turned out to be absolute hell for the monsters of the KBR and were treated horribly by the guards. In the first 2 weeks alone, more than half of the organization that had been thrown into the legendary prison had ended up killing themselves. Unable to stand the hell that they were reaping from the evil seeds they had sown their whole lives. Their bodies, just like every other criminal that died at Deadheat, was carted up to the mouth of the Deadfire volcano on top of the mountain and thrown into the boiling hot cauldron of magma below. Their filthy and vile remains completely melted and done away with in mere seconds by the hungry depths of Deadfire. As of right now in Kanto, only very, very small groups of the KBR remained in hiding and were still being hunted down mercilessly by the police. The officers were only too happy to use excessive force whenever they encountered and arrested these tiny groups. Especially the officer Jennies. It was definitely safe to say that many great things had happened over the last 2 months and everything had worked out better than anyone could have hoped for. Ash had even been developing new training methods and techniques for all of his Pokémon during the time that he obviously had to make for training over their 2-month hiatus from traveling. After all, it was like Ash said, "You're only as great as the time you invest into your dreams." Wise words for a kid. Now, here he and his friends were, standing atop a large stage overlooking all of the people of the city. Today was actually a celebration of sorts to commemorate all of the good things had happened and all of the new bonds that had been forged over the last 2 months. Amazingly enough, the people of Hutber Port and the Pokémon of the coral reefs had grown close to one another and formed an understanding and coexisting bond of sorts. Ever since everyone had went out of their way to help one another. The people helping the Pokémon restore their coral reef homes and the Pokémon helping to rebuild the city, a sort of trust and harmony had been established between people and Pokémon. Truly impressive considering that just 2 months prior the relations between both sides had been strained at best and hostile at worst. Ash looked up at the giant Tentacruel, who was towering behind Ash and the stage in the water of the harbor along with the rest of its kin, and gave it a bright smile as he reached out and gently touched one of the Pokémon's tentacles, which was set behind Ash like a big building. The immense Pokémon looked down at the boy and gave what could be best described as an eye smile to Ash since it didn't really have the ability to make facial gestures with its mouth. Another amazing thing that happened over the last 2 months is how close Ash and Tentacruel had truly become. I mean sure, Ash and all of his friends had been accepted, loved and befriended by all of the reef Pokémon after they had helped them, just like the people of Hutber had also grown to love them. But it was different with Tentacruel. Ash and the great Pokémon had formed a tight bond over the last 2 months by doing things as simple as Ash riding around on Tentacruel's head as it walked the oceans outside the city while simply enjoying each other's company, to Ash releasing Dragonite from her Pokeball after he had Tentacruel take them far enough from the city and then having light spars and training sessions with Tentacruel while he sat on Dragonite's head and coached the two. Both giant Pokémon had also formed a close bond as well over the last 2 months and had become sort of like sparring partners. While Ash's friends stayed behind on days when there was no work to be done anywhere and would just hang out with the Tentacruel, and other reef Pokémon, Ash would grab Pikachu and then head out with Tentacruel towards the open ocean and spend the day just he, Pikachu, Tentacruel and Dragonite. Well, that wasn't entirely true. You see, something that Ash didn't really know about Giselle, since he hadn't really had an extended period of time to just be with her when nothing was going on, was that she could be very clingy. Since all they had done for the last 2 months was work around the city, hang out with the reef Pokémon and if you were Ash, Giselle and their Pokémon. Train like dogs even after a hard day's work, Ash had a lot of time to just spend with his friends and his girlfriend. Giselle loved being with him even when they weren't doing anything or even saying anything. She was totally happy just wrapping her arm around his and following him wherever he went, just enjoying his presence. They would always sit down near the water and watch the sun go down every evening after they had finished their brutal training. Giselle would sit in Ash's lap and snuggle into his bare chest, since he would usually discard the top of his tracksuit for his workouts, and sigh in content as he wrapped his arms around and held her close as they watched the sunset. Sometimes they would just kiss while the sun was setting and other times they would fall asleep in each other's arms, exhausted from the busy day. For Giselle, any time that wasn't spent with Ash was basically a waste of time in her opinion. She was very attached to him and loved being with him. After the first couple of times he had left to go and spend the day with Pikachu, Tentacruel and Dragonite, Giselle asked if she could go along. Ash was going to happily accept his girlfriend's offer either way, however. She for some reason decided to ask with the biggest pair of Growlithe puppy eyes and cutest lip pout he had ever seen, which made Ash not only enthusiastically tell her, of course, but also led him to locking lips with her for a good 5 minutes straight. So basically, the bonding days for Ash always consisted of he, Pikachu, Dragonite, Tentacruel and Giselle. Funnily enough, Tentacruel had grown to love Giselle just like Pikachu, Dragonite and all of Ash's other Pokémon did. Not surprising though, since Giselle was a very likable person. Especially nowadays, since she had outgrown her snobbish, rich girl ways. Tentacruel had also hit it off well with Bulbasaur, Charmander, Squirtle, Gyarados before Ash sent him back to the lab, and then Pidgeotto once Ash got her back. He was very happy to see that his Pokémon took to Tentacruel so well. Although, he guessed that he shouldn't have been surprised really. After all, they did have time to get used to a giant Dragonite, so what was a similar-sized Tentacruel really? Ash wasn't the only one benefiting from the extended stay at Hutberport either. Brock had been studying all of the reef Pokémon so he could learn more as a Pokémon breeder, and Misty had been in heaven with being around so many water Pokémon. She loved Tentacool and Tentacruel, and since she released her own freshly captured Tentacool, which she had found out was a male, every day she was at the reefs so it could still interact with its friends, she had earned Tentacool's respect and loyalty. She had also become much closer to Horsey as well, and had even ended up capturing the small Pokémon one day when he made it clear that he wanted to become her Pokémon since it liked her so much. Misty was, safe to say, very happy. 2 new water Pokémon in 2 months. No, she wasn't happy. She was ecstatic. Ash was broken from his reverie by the mayor of the city closing up his speech by saying, "And now, ladies and gentlemen of Hutberport, I give you one of the heroes responsible for saving our fair city and establishing such a wonderful relationship with our neighbors, the Pokémon of the coral reefs. Please give a round of applause for Ash Ketchum." He finished. The crowd cheered loudly as the older man stepped down from the podium and motioned for Ash to come up. The boy shared a smile with his friends, a nod with Pikachu and a kiss with Giselle before walking up to the microphone smiling. He stood up on the podium and looked over the gathered crowd. "Hello ladies and gentlemen, citizens of Hutberport." He spoke with sureness and confidence into the microphone. The crowd cheered in response and he smiled wider. "You know, I was asked to come up here today and speak to all of you about everything that happened in the last 2 months and talk about how amazing it all is, and truly yes. It is amazing. So many wonderful things happened out of a situation that I believe many of you thought wouldn't have any positives to it, didn't you?" he asked. The crowd collectively nodded their heads and others murmured their agreement. Ash continued. "Ya see. I know I'm just a kid, me and my friends, and I know that some of you are probably thinking that I don't know about the things I'm talking about, but I do." He looked out over the crowd. "My friends and I love Pokémon more than just about everything. We don't count our friends and family in this because for us, our Pokémon is our friends and a part of our family. My dream, my promise to myself, my Pokémon in this world is to become the greatest Pokémon master that has ever and will ever live. My friends also all have similar goals of some kind that is pushing them on to become great. If we have learned one thing, if I have learned one thing in the short time that I've been raising my Pokémon, it's that. We are all one and a part of the same world and the same design. We're just as important as the other is, and in order to achieve true understanding, peace and harmony, we have to stand together with Pokémon and take care of them just like they do for us. Over the last 2 months, all of you in the Pokémon of the coral reefs found a way to overcome your hard feelings for each other and become friends. You found a way to live in harmony. I hope you can all remember the unity and bond that you share forever. That's all I have to say, thank you everyone." He finished. The crowd broke out into loud applause and cheered like crazy as Ash stepped off the podium. The mayor patted Ash on the shoulder as he passed him on his way back to the microphone. "Very well said, young man," he told the boy with a smile. Ash returned the smile and then joined his friends again at the back of the stage, sharing a smile with Brock and Misty and then grabbing Giselle by the waist and pulling her close as he kissed her. She eagerly responded by wrapping her arms around his neck and deepening the kiss. When they separated, they smiled lovingly at each other and then turned their attention back to the mayor, who was speaking again, as they intertwined their hands. Ash brought Giselle's hand up to his mouth and kissed it tenderly before bringing her hand back down and then just stroking it softly with the thumb of his own hand. The mayor was now just finishing his speech. And so, to commemorate the friendship, peace and unity that we now share with the Pokémon of the reef. As a way to always remember what has happened, I hereby declare that the Hutber Coral Reefs shall be renamed on this day to the Harmony Coral Reefs. He announced loudly. The people cheered loudly and the mayor just waited for it to die down. Once it did, he continued. Now let's all enjoy this day as the first of many to come. The day of the Harmony Festival. There was another loud cheer and then everyone broke off and made their way into the city for the festivities. The entire crowd on top of the stage cleared out as well and made their way towards the city as the many Tentacool and Tentacruel of the reefs also went to join the celebrations. Ash looked up at the giant Tentacruel and then his friends. Come on guys. Let's go have some fun, he said excitedly. Everyone cheered and then headed towards the city and celebrations. Followed each step of the way by the thundering footfalls of Tentacruel as it joined them. Albeit carefully so it didn't destroy anything in the city this time. It was definitely safe to say that today was a very special day. The day that the people and Pokémon of Hutber learned to live together in peace and harmony. The first of many harmony days to come. XXXXXXXXXXXX. Time skip. Next day. The next day rolled around and it was now time for Ash and the others to finally leave Hutber Port and continue their journeys. They were very proud to say that they helped in bringing about so much great change in the city and had also learned much in the process as well. They made many new friends and had a great time during their stay. Especially at the Harmony Festival. However now, it was time to leave and say goodbye to those friends. After they had each said goodbye to everyone who they cared for and had made as friends in the city, they decided to finish stocking up on everything they needed for the road before heading to their next stop, the Pokémon Center. Upon finally reaching the Pokémon Center and seeing that their Pokémon were now finished and ready to go, they took them back from the kind Nurse Joy and then decided to have lunch at the center before they left for their last stop in the city. We currently find our young heroes sitting around the tables in the Poké Center, finishing up their meals. Ash had just finished his salad and looked over at Brock. So, where do we head to now, Brock? He asked. The squinty-eyed teen finished his own food and then pulled out the map. Well, it looks here like we can either just leave the city and get back on the main road, which will eventually take us straight into Saffron City where you can challenge 2 gyms. The main gym is run by a girl named Sabrina who uses psychic-type Pokémon and claims to be a psychic herself. The second gym is a fighting-type specific one and is run by Dojo Master Kyo. Back when both gyms wanted to become the Saffron City Gym, they were told by the league that only one could become the official Pokémon gym of the city. So in the end, both leaders from each gym battled each other and the winner would have their gym as the main one in the city. Since the Psychic-type gym obviously had the type advantage over the Fighting-type gym, they beat them easily and became the official gym of the city. You won't win a badge by defeating the Fighting-type gym, but it would be good for experience, Brock advised. Ash nodded his head thoughtfully and stayed silent for a few moments. Option 2. He finally asked. Brock looked back down at the map. Option 2 will end up also taking us to Saffron City eventually, but it's a very long detour and not widely used by most trainers. There's a ferry that leaves here from Hutber and sails around the coast until it makes port at a small coastal town that is famously known for a stone monument and lookout area called Maiden's Peak, which overlooks the ocean. Once you leave this town, it'll take you deeper into Kanto and through less traveled roads and visited cities. It also shows here that by taking this route you would also come across at least 4 different Pokémon gyms that you would have to make a slight detour to get to since they are kinda out of the way gyms. Ash looked extremely interested at hearing that bit of new information and ushered Brock to go on. The teen found his place on the map again before he continued. It also looks like somewhere on this route you'll eventually come out into a valley of sorts called the Butterfree Cliffs, which is basically a wide open area surrounded by forest on one side and the ocean closer towards the cliff side on the other. This place is actually pretty popular for trainers of Butterfree since the Pokémon meet there every year to pair off with a mate before flying across the ocean towards their breeding grounds somewhere in the Orange Islands. Trainers usually release their Butterfree at this mass gathering so they can find mates and go on to live happy lives and make their babies. Judging by what I've heard of this place myself, I think the Butterfree mating season is coming up really soon actually. Ash just nodded his head at this. Sounds interesting for sure. I think stopping by there would be a good idea so I can give either one or both of my Butterfree the chance to find a mate. I think that would happy. He said with another nod of his head, pleased with his idea. Giselle looked taken aback. But Ash, you would have to end up releasing them if they did find mates. She said softly as she placed a hand on his. Ash just chuckled and shook his head as he gently grasped Giselle's hand and placed flutter kisses on the top of it. No, actually, Giselle, I wouldn't. He stated matter-of-factly. All three of his friends looked confused, so he elaborated. Why would most trainers release their hard-trained Butterfree after it found a mate? He asked them all. Upon receiving more confused looks, he continued. Think about it, guys. A trainer who could only have 6 Pokémon on them at one time and didn't have someplace that was knowledgeable on Pokémon breeding and the care of baby Pokémon to send them would never be able to have a breeding pair of Butterfree with them. After the babies were born, they would have no room left to carry them on their team, and that's even considering that maybe they know how to care of baby Pokémon themselves. It's the only thing they can do if they want their Butterfree to be happy with their mates. Release them so they go out into the world and have their babies with nothing holding them back. I, on the other hand, thank Arceus, don't have that problem. He stated. What do you mean, Ash? Misty asked for all of them. He smiled and leaned back in his chair. I do have somewhere to send my Butterfree and their mates if they find one. Professor Oak's Pokeranch is massive and can easily sustain hundreds of Butterfree. Both of my Butterfree and their mates could easily raise a large family at the ranch and never have to migrate anywhere. Not to mention Professor Oak himself is very well versed in the care and raising of baby Pokémon and Pokémon breeding as a whole. Something he was also teaching me about during our 5-year training. Ash finished as he tilted his chair back and forth with his hands behind his head, almost looking bored. All three of his friends' eyes widened. You could essentially have hundreds of Butterfree eventually. Misty all but shouted. Ash just shrugged his shoulders lazily as his chair came to a stop. I guess so. Never thought of it like that, but it's definitely a pretty sweet incentive, huh? He said with a grin. His friends and Pikachu just sweat dropped at Ash's casual way of dealing with possibly becoming the trainer of hundreds of Butterfree. Brock finally broke the silence as he shook his head and cleared his throat. Well, cool then, Ash. I'm glad you have everything so well planned out. He praised. Yeah, Ash, way to go. Misty agreed. Pika Pie Pikachu. Pikachu said, tapping his trainer on the head to show he was happy for Ash. That's my guy. Giselle said proudly as she got up from her seat and then plopped down on Ash's lap, wrapping his arms around her waist. Always thinking ahead. Ash grinned and kissed Giselle's neck, making her giggle as he looked at Brock. Please continue, dear Brock, he said with an exaggerated dip of his head. Brock just chuckled at his friend's antics and then resumed reading the map while speaking. Yes, well. After the 4th gym on this route you would then come across a small place called Lavender Town, the last place you reach before Saffron City. That's famous for a place called Pokémon Tower, which is abandoned and said to be home to ghost-type Pokémon. People of the town say that scary and sometimes dangerous things happen around the tower, so they stay away at all times, warning any travelers that come through to do the same or risk injury. And maybe even worse, he said ominously. Misty and Giselle shivered at Brock's explanation of the spooky-sounding tower and the mishaps surrounding it. Ghost T-type P Pokémon? Giselle asked with a scared edge to her voice. Ash turned to his girlfriend. What's wrong with ghost Pokémon, Giselle? He asked her curiously. Giselle shivered again. They're just so creepy and scary looking. I learned at Pokemon Tech that ghost types can be really tricky and can also love to play pranks on people because of their ability to disappear and reappear at will. Egg. It just creeps me out. She said, shivering again. Yeah, it doesn't sound very pleasant at Lavender Town or the Pokemon Tower. Misty agreed with a tremble in her voice. I would be totally happy avoiding any and all creepy ghost Pokemon. Ash just chuckled and got up from the table and then sat down in between Misty and Giselle. He wrapped his arms around both of them and pulled them in close. Giselle squeaked in surprise and Misty blushed a deep red at being against Ash. Now ladies, Ash said haughtily with a funny look on his face. You should know that nothing will happen to you as long as I'm around. I'll protect you from any and all that may try to harm you no matter what. That's a promise, he said with a big, closed eyes grin at each of them. Misty just continued to blush crimson and separated from Ash with mumbled words of gratitude and a hazy look in her eyes. Giselle just smiled and kissed Ash softly. I know you would, Ash, and thank you, she said warmly. He smiled at her and then looked away thoughtfully for a little bit. He formed a serious look on his face and looked at Brock. I want to take the detour route, Brock. Not only will I be able to earn 4 more badges, get more battle experience for myself and my Pokemon and face new opponents, which will in turn help me develop new strategies and battle styles, but also. He paused and then crossed his arms. If Lavender Town really does have ghost types in Pokemon Tower like you say they do, then that's where I need to head first before challenging Sabrina. I think it would be wise to capture and train a ghost type before taking on her psychic Pokemon. I'm sure I could defeat Sabrina with the Pokemon I have with me now and back at the lab if we battled very intelligently, used careful and sound strategies and played it safe, but still. I don't want to take chances. Capturing, training a ghost Pokemon and then creating a very unorthodox battle strategy would be the best way to go, I believe. He shrugged his shoulders. Of course, I'll also work with whatever Pokemon I decide to use in the battle besides my ghost type, that way I can have an all-around effective strategy and battle plan. If I do capture a ghost type, which I've heard is really tough and not just because they're rare in the Kanto region, I won't just rely on that one Pokemon no matter how trained and strong I make them. If a trainer relies on the strength and strategies of one Pokemon, no matter how powerful, it's easier for your opponent to create a strategy to defeat you even if you have the type advantage, like I would using a ghost Pokemon against Sabrina's psychic types. He paused again and closed his eyes before continuing. Gym leaders are gym leaders for a reason. They're usually smart and adaptable to most situations. That means you should never feel comfortable in any battle against one, or any opponent for that matter, until you and your Pokemon have won and it's over. Psychic types are usually very smart, which means that Sabrina is most likely smart as well and won't be that frazzled by something as small as a type advantage. I need to outthink her and beat her at her own game. Which, even though I don't know her, I bet her game clearly revolves around intelligence. I'm going to capture a ghost type and then train it and whatever other Pokemon I decide to use in ways that will throw Sabrina off her game. She will most likely expect a ghost Pokemon trained the usual way, not an abnormally trained one, and different Pokemon ranging from several different types that are equally as odd when it comes to their style of battling. Take out your opponent's foundation and then everything else falls as well, he said, opening his eyes. Brock, Misty and Giselle were yet again shocked by Ash's intelligence, maturity, battle smarts and almost calculative ways of thinking. They still couldn't believe he was just a rookie trainer. Brock snapped out of his stupor and nodded. Okay, Ash, we'll go down to the harbor and buy our ferry tickets before saying goodbye to the reef Pokemon, he said. Ash nodded and then all 3 trainers grabbed their bags. Ash motioning for Pikachu to jump up on his shoulder and the electric mouse did so in one bound. Pika Pie. He chirped happily as he nuzzled Ash's cheek and pointed towards the door with an excited look on his face. Ash chuckled and scratched his Pokemon behind the ears. That's the spirit, buddy, he said enthusiastically. The 4 friends, plus Pikachu, then left the center and headed for the harbor. After purchasing the tickets for the ferry down at the harbor, Ash and his friends then got a boat near the docks that a kind man who absolutely loved Ash and his friends and let them use the boat anytime they wanted to go out and visit the reefs. After they all piled into the boat, Brock drove them out to the reef where the reef Pokémon were always gathered. They finally got out far enough until they were right over top of the reef and began seeing the many Pokémon that called the reef home swimming around in the water below, enjoying having their beautiful home restored back to its original glory and luster. And beautiful it truly was. Ash and his friends always were struck in awe every time they visited and couldn't believe that Nastina could have ever tried to destroy such a natural wonder. Upon arriving, Brock cut the engine and then they all watched as the many reef Pokémon began surfacing to greet their visitors. Before long, the water was filled with Goldeen, Seeking, Tentacool, Staryu, Starmie, Tentacruel, a few Magikarp and even Horsey. A large shape then began rising up out of a deeper part of the reef until soon the giant Tentacruel stood towering above them all. Ash and his friends greeted the Pokémon and Misty released her Tentacool and Horsey so they could see their friends one last time. After spending some time with the Pokémon, Ash looked up at the giant Tentacruel. Tentacruel. He looked out at all of the other Pokémon. Everyone. All of the Pokémon turned their attention to Ash and he looked at them all sadly. We've just came here because we're leaving the city today to continue our journey and we wanted to say goodbye to all of you before we did. He said sadly with his head down. All of the Pokémon looked very saddened at hearing this and all looked down as well. Giselle was also very upset but tried to lift all of their spirits regardless. Hey, don't be upset everyone. We're leaving now but we'll all come back to visit one day. Isn't that right you guys? She asked her friends. Absolutely. Misty said with tears in her eyes as she saw Tentacool and Horsey say their said goodbyes to their friends. Without a doubt. Brock agreed. Giselle smiled at them all. See. We'll see each other again someday. She said, trying to sound chipper for everyone's sake even though she was on the verge of tears herself. Right, Ash? She asked out to her boyfriend. When she didn't hear him say anything in reply, she turned around, along with Brock and Misty, and saw Ash staring up at Tentacruel with unshed tears brimming in his eyes. Well, he said huskily. I'm really going to miss you, Tentacruel. He looked down. You're a really great Pokémon and his voice started to crack. I was really glad I got to meet you. You're a good friend and you have a lot of potential to be really great. I hope you keep your home and fellow Pokémon safe for a long time to come and someday. We'll see each other again, alright. He finally looked back up at Tentacruel as a lone tear ran down his cheek. Giselle's heart broke when she saw how hard a time her boyfriend was having saying goodbye to Tentacruel. Those two had become close and even Dragonite and Tentacruel had become good friends. She was sure that Dragonite was happy about not feeling so alone due to her height when she was around Tentacruel and knew that she would miss the other giant Pokémon as well. Ash, however, he was taking it very hard. Oh Ash, she said, coming up to give him a hug from behind while Brock and Misty watched on sadly. Tentacruel looked down at Ash with clear sadness and sorrow in its eyes at the fact that Ash, the one human it liked and respected more than any other, was leaving. The massive Pokémon hung its head down low and suddenly looked to be in deep thought. After what seemed like forever, the great Pokémon seemed to come to a major decision and motion for one of the larger and stronger looking Tentacruel that was mixed in with the rest of the reef Pokémon to come closer. The Pokémon obeyed and swam its way over to its giant leader. Tentacruel bent down low and began communicating with the smaller Pokémon. The smaller Tentacruel went wide-eyed as its leader gave its orders and looked beyond shocked and surprised at everything its leader was ordering it to do. When the giant Tentacruel was done giving its orders, it looked down at the other Pokémon, placed the tip of one of its massive tentacles gently on top of the smaller one's head and gave a look that seemed to ask if it understood everything it had been instructed to do. The smaller Tentacruel just nodded its head dumbly and then waded back into the crowd of other Pokémon. The giant Pokémon then looked down at all of the reef Pokémon and addressed them. Ash and his friends watched in confusion as Tentacruel spoke with the Pokémon and saw all of them flash between looks of confusion, shock, sadness and ultimately then understanding. Tentacruel nodded its head satisfied and then looked down at Ash. The boy and Pokémon looked at each other for some time in complete silence until Ash broke the silence. Tentacruel, what did you just tell them? He asked baffled. The Pokémon just lifted one massive tentacle and pointed it at Ash. The boy looked even more confused. I'm sorry Tentacruel, but I don't understand what you want, he said. Tentacruel shifted its tentacle until Ash felt it touch one of the Pokeballs on his side. His eyes widened in realization. Do you want to become my Pokémon and travel and train with me, Tentacruel? He asked in shock. Tentacruel just gave Ash an eye smile and nodded its head in confirmation. Giselle, Misty and Brock's eyes widened in amazement. Ash just looked completely lost. But what about all of the reef Pokémon here that you look after, Tentacruel? He asked. Tentacruel just pointed to the other Tentacruel that it had talked with moments before. Ash thought about it for a minute. So what you're saying is, you passed down the leadership and protection of the reef and all of the Pokémon here to that Tentacruel so you can become my Pokémon? He asked. Tentacruel nodded again and Ash looked taken aback. He just stood there for a little while and looked to be in thought. He looked up at Pikachu. What do you think, Pi? Would you be excited to have Tentacruel join the ranks? He asked his starter. Pikachu looked up at Tentacruel and gave it a peace sign. Pikachu. Pika Pi. Pika Pika Pikachu Pika. He smiled up at the giant Pokémon, who in return, I smiled, at the much smaller Pokémon. Ash then smiled widely, so wide it looked as though his face would split apart. He thrusted his fist into the air. Alright. Then Tentacruel. He gave the Pokémon a thumbs up. Welcome to the team, buddy. He pulled out an empty Pokeball and tossed it up in the air, catching it again. You ready? He asked the massive water type. Tentacruel nodded its head with a look of genuine excitement on its face. Here goes then, Ash said as he reared his arm back. Pokeball. Go. He yelled as he threw the ball up as far as he could. Tentacruel reached out and touched the small ball with one of its large tentacles. The Pokeball made contact with the appendage and opened up. Instantly upon contact, the gargantuan Pokémon was sucked inside of the ball in a flash of red light and disappeared, the ball snapping shut behind it. The ball fell out of the air and landed in Ash's outstretched hand. The ball only rocked a few hand times in Ash's hand before going still and dinging, in the sign of a complete capture as blue sparkles burst from the ball. And just like that, Ash Ketchum, a rookie trainer, was now in possession of two giant Pokémon. Two extremely rare and powerful Pokémon. Ash just stared at the ball in his hand dumbly for a few moments before thrusting it into the air. One more for the team. A giant Tentacruel, he said excitedly. Pikachu called out happily from his shoulder with his fist also in the air. Pikachu. Brock, Giselle and Misty just shook their heads in wonder. Only Ash. Misty said amusedly. You can always expect the unexpected with him. Brock shook his head. That's my boyfriend, Giselle said proudly as she shrugged with her hands in the air. Ash smiled fondly at the Pokeball in his hand before showing it to the large assembly of gathered Pokémon. I promise all of you that Tentacruel will be safe and very happy with me. I'm going to help make your friend and leader stronger and more powerful than any of you, or it could ever imagine. I promise, he vowed. The Pokémon of the reef trusted Ash because of everything he had did for them, and so they believed him when he said that he would care of Tentacruel and assured them that their former leader would be well looked after and happy. Giselle slipped her hand into Ash's free one. Congratulations on capturing Tentacruel, Ash. If anybody deserved it, you did. You worked really hard for its trust and now you have another powerful Pokémon and friend to show for it. She said chirpily. Ash nodded. Yeah, I know. I feel like the luckiest trainer ever right now. He answered her. Brock suddenly intervened. I'm also really happy for you, Ash, but we might want to get going. The ferry will be leaving in about an hour. He announced. Right. Ash agreed. He turned back to all of the Pokémon. Thank you guys for accepting us the way you have. It means a lot and we all really appreciate it. I hope to see you all again someday. He bid them goodbye. They called out to him in farewell and he then turned to Misty. You might want to go ahead and return your Pokémon, Misty. He told her. She agreed and then let her Pokémon say goodbye again before returning them and then sitting back down in the boat. Brock revved up the engine and then began pulling away from the reef as they all waved back at the Pokémon. The reef Pokémon waved back with their different appendages at the children in farewell and the two groups just continued to wave until they were out of sight of one another. Turning back around and sitting in the boat again, Ash looked down fondly at Tentacruel's Pokeball. He kept thinking about just how strong Tentacruel would become with the right training and couldn't wait to start working with him. Suddenly, the Pokeball began glowing blue and started rattling back and forth. Ash instantly recognized that his Pokeball was getting ready to be teleported to Professor Oak's labs since he already had 6 Pokemon on him. Before Ash could do anything, the Pokeball vanished into thin air and Ash was left staring at his empty hand with disbelief etched onto his face. He had completely forgotten to send back Dragonite and Gyarados over the last 2 months and now he was paying for it. Oh no. He groaned as he leaned backwards and fell out of his seat and into Giselle's lap. What's wrong, Ash? Giselle asked, concerned. Ash just rolled over and pressed his face into the side of Giselle's soft, exposed thigh that was exposed more than usual since she was sitting and her skirt was hiked up a little. She blushed crimson at the position Ash was in and heard him mumble something into her thigh. She strained her ears to listen. What? She asked, totally missing what he said. He rolled back over until he was looking up at her face. I said. He began. Professor Oak had no warning whatsoever about Tentacruel arriving at the lab and is now going to be getting a huge shock. He said exasperatedly. Oh. That could be a problem. Giselle agreed with him. Poor Professor Oak. Probably going to have a heart attack all because of Ash. Misty said teasingly. Ash gave her a dark look and just glared at her. Shut up, Misty, it's not funny. He argued. It actually kinda is. Misty started laughing. I feel bad for the professor as well, poor guy has no clue what's coming. Added Brock in an amused tone. Ash just rolled back over into Giselle's thigh and groaned again. Go ahead. Laugh it up, guys. He groaned again. If Professor Oak has a heart attack after seeing Tentacruel, you won't be laughing then. He said, shaking his fist at them. Giselle just smiled amusingly at her pouting boyfriend and rubbed his back soothingly. It's okay, Ash, don't worry about it, everything will be okay. She said soothingly to him while trying to hold in her own laughter while Misty was practically rolling in hysterics and Brock was also struggling to not laugh at his friend's plight. Pikachu just sweat dropped at his trainer's behavior. Pika. He with his head tilted to the side as Ash continued to sulk comically. XXXXXXXXX. Oak Pokemon Research Laboratory, Pallet Town. Professor Oak and Delia were sitting in the living area of the lab, drinking some tea while they watched the news on TV. They had been watching the report on the events that had happened in Hutber Port and to say that they were shocked and in Delia's case, scared, to find out that Ash and his friends had been right in the center of it all was astounding to say the least. Well. Professor Oak spoke up. It seems as though our young Ash is becoming quite the hero, isn't he? Professor Oak said with pride in his voice at hearing about the kind and selfless deeds Ash was performing. Delia, however, wasn't so happy. What are you talking about, Professor? Ash could have been killed during that attack. It's a blessing from Arceus that he's still even alive. I can't believe he would do something so reckless. She ranted. The professor raised a questioning eyebrow. You can't. Come now, Delia, you know that you're not being honest with yourself. You know how much Ash takes after his father. Richard was always getting himself into messes trying to help someone else or to save a Pokemon. Ash is the same way and the proof is on that TV screen right there. He said, pointing at the TV. He looked back at Delia and his eyes softened. You will need to learn to accept the fact that Ash is exactly like his father and is also growing up. Being on a Pokemon journey changes people and makes them grow up fast. You and I have always known just how special and unique Ash is. This is just something that we will all have to accept about him. Besides, it's not like he's getting himself involved with dangerous criminals like Team Rocket. Now if that were the case, then there would be reason to fear because of how dangerous they are. As it is though, that's not the case, poor naive fool. Just try and relax, dear. He comforted her. Delia remained silent for a while and then looked back at the professor. You're right, Professor Oak. Thank you for that. Ash is growing up and truly is just like his father. I knew the risks when he left to go on his journey, and now all I can do is pray to Arceus that Ash will stay safe. She said with a small smile on her face and hope in her voice. The professor smiled and nodded. And that's all you can do, my dear. Just trust that Ash will remain safe and keep your thoughts and hopes with him. He told her wisely. They suddenly heard the automated voice of the lab start speaking as they heard Professor Oak's computer. Ding. Trainer profile update. Trainer profile update. Newly captured Pokémon alert for trainer Ash Ketchum. Poke. Transfer in process now. Please stand by. The automated voice announced. Professor Oak smiled widely and stood up. You see, Delia, Ash is just fine. He's even out catching new Pokémon. He said mirthfully. Delia smiled herself. That is a relief. I'm glad to know that Ash is definitely okay after all and is still doing what trainers do. It makes me worry less. She said with relief in her voice. Professor Oak nodded his head and smiled. Well, I'll be back, Delia. I'm going to go see what Pokémon Ash has captured and then I'll be back after I'm done with the routine checkups. He told her. Delia stood up. Actually, Professor, would you mind if I come with you? She asked. I want to see my son's new Pokémon, please. The kind professor merely nodded again. Of course you can. Now let's go, I'm anxious to see this new Pokémon. He said happily as he bounded down the steps of the upper lab and down into the Poké-transfer room. Delia giggled at the professor's antics. For being an older man, he definitely didn't let life get him down. Anytime the subject of Pokémon was brought up, the professor would turn into a little kid just like Richard and Ash. Bouncing with excitement. She walked down to the room Professor Oak was in and saw him sitting at one of the many computers in the room, typing away on the keyboard. She walked closer to the desk and saw her son's trainer profile pulled up on the computer. What are we looking for, Professor? She asked. He merely pointed to a column in the right-hand corner that told all of the Pokémon Ash had and the numbers of how many of the same species he had. Delia was still shocked seeing the number of 6 Gyarados and the Dragonite that her son had already captured. Gyarados were very hard to train from what she heard because of their temper, and most trainers had difficulties raising one. Her son on the other hand had 6, and according to the professor, they all listened to Ash perfectly. Dragonite was another case in point. She knew how rare and powerful they were from the stories Richard had told about his own Dragonite that he had once had. Even her husband, who Pokémon loved, couldn't earn his Dragonite's respect and ended up losing it. Here her son was, however, and he already had a Dragonite that listened to him perfectly, loved him if what Professor Oak said was true, and it wasn't just any Pokémon either. It was a giant, massive Dragonite. Yes, it was true and clear as could be for Delia. Her son was a very special Pokémon trainer and she could see him going far, very far with his dream. She suddenly saw the image of another Pokémon appear under her son's Pokémon obtained list. She looked confused. What Pokémon is that, Professor? She asked. That, Delia, is a Tentacruel. They're water poison type Pokémon that mostly lives in the oceans and are rather aggressive at the worst of times. I guess he must have captured one near the coast where they are now. He answered her. A few moments later, the Pokeball teleporter in the lab suddenly turned on and began making a whirling noise, signaling that a Pokeball was on its way. A few seconds later, a Pokeball appeared in a flash of blue light and then the machine cut off. Professor Oak and Delia walked over to the container tube that had the Pokeball resting inside of it, and the professor reached out and grabbed it. He held it up and inspected it and then took the ball over to some other equipment in the room. He began performing some routine checks on the Pokémon inside of the Pokeball and then walked back over to Delia when he was done. It's completely fine. Some of this Pokemon's vitals seems to be a little unusual, but that could just be a temporary effect from the teleportation. Since this is a water Pokemon Delia, I would like to take this new addition of Ash's team down to the new lake in the woods that many of his Pokemon now train and gather around. I feel that this Pokemon would be more comfortable getting introduced to Ash's Pokemon in the water instead of on land where it won't be as comfortable, I fear. He explained. Delia nodded. Sure, Professor, lead the way, she said cheerfully. Professor Oak led the way down into the Pokefields of the Oak Ranch as he and Delia made their way down to where Ash's Pokemon always seemed to be. They passed the pond where his Pokemon used to solely stay near until Dragonite helped create the new large lake in the forest further on. They saw several of Ash's Pokemon doing what they did best as they passed the pond, training hard. They were all wearing body weights that Professor Oak had Professor Sycamore from the Kalos region send more of over. They saw Pidgeotto and Firo high up in the air above the pond working on speed drills as fast as they could while they sparred almost viciously. Nidorina and Nidorino were clashing fiercely together and looked very battered and bruised. They were breathing hard and clearly exhausted but kept battling. Primeape was savagely training its body and working its fighting techniques on a bunch of large boulders further near the treeline of the forest. Clefairy was alternating between working on her physical training, her attacks and especially metronome on several big rocks around her, trying to make it stronger. Staryu and Ash's giant Krabby were drilling speed, agility, attacks and combat in the waters of the pond and were looking very strong. Professor Oak called out to all of them. Training going well, everyone? He asked kindly. They all stopped what they were doing at the same time and called out an affirmative in a chorus of different Pokecalls. He nodded and held up the Pokeball he was carrying. Ash has just captured a new Pokemon and I was wondering if you would all like to come with Delia and I to the lake and meet your new teammate. It's part water type, so I think meeting it in its natural habitat would be better. What do you say? All of the Pokemon seemed very eager to meet this new teammate, especially Krabby and Staryu since they were also water types. The professor received another eager chorus of calls as a response to his question and he just nodded again. Then follow me, everyone, he said as he and Delia continued on into the forest behind the pond, followed by the Pokemon. They continued on into the forest until they eventually entered a very large clearing that had a large body of water sprawled out before them. Here they saw the rest of Ash's Pokemon training. Both of the Butterfree and Beedrill were flying in the air above working aerial combat, speed, accuracy and their attack power. Raticate and the two female Rattata were darting in and out between the trees outside of the clearing, working on speed, agility, endurance and also stopping to do 2-on-1 matches with each other. Paris, Weepinbell, Oddish and Roselia were all engaging in a full-on spar with each other, wearing very heavy body weights and working on an area of skill today that was uncommon for grass bug types. They were working on pure power and strength both physically and in their attacks. Usually grass and bug Pokemon just relied on the speed of their attacks, strategy and status effective moves to beat their opponents. Which was something that Ash's grass types, Bulbasaur, Roselia, Weepinbell, Oddish and his bug types, Paris, both Butterfree and Beedrill, worked on religiously as well. However, they were also very big into working on areas of strength that was uncommon for Pokemon of their types. Like pure power, strength, endurance and brute force. In fact, all of Ash's Pokemon did this. They trained for hours every single day, only taking rest long enough to eat, drink and sleep. Professor Oak swore they were as big of training maniacs as Ash was and worked themselves to the bloody bone every day. What was interesting, however, is the fact that all of his Pokemon trained themselves, on Ash's instruction, in not just their own natural strengths, like strengths unique to their individual species or unique to just themselves. But they also worked vigorously on all things that their individual species, or just they themselves was either weak or not very strong in. Like Ash's flying types Pidgeotto and Firo working on running and training on the ground to increase their leg strength and speed. Always while wearing heavy body and leg weights. Not as heavy as the wing weights they wore while flying to work their speed, agility and endurance, but still heavy. Something flying Pokémon were not known to do. Ash had also called into the lab nearly 2 months ago and asked to speak with his flying, or at least, winged, Pokémon, Fearow, Pidgeotto, both Butterfree and Beedrill. He also asked to speak with Staryu and Krabby and had asked his water types to please teach his 5 winged Pokémon, something that truly shocked Professor Oak. He asked for them to start training Pidgeotto, the Butterfree, Beedrill and Fearow how to swim, then teach them how to battle, move faster, more gracefully and fight more effectively while in and below the water if they got a hold of the concept of swimming all right. Ash said that he realized just how effective battling in the water really was and ended up wanting all of his Pokémon to become very efficient and skilled at moving and battling not just on land, but also in the water. He and his on-hand Pokémon had been working swimming drills like crazy in the oceans they were always near lately, and he wanted his Pokémon back at the lab to do the same. To Professor Oak's astonishment, all of Ash's Pokémon began working with their usual all-out training intensity and added water drills and swimming exercises every day to their training regimen under the instruction of Krabby and Staryu. 2 Pokémon that, even though they were both water types, never felt they were good enough in their natural habitat and so trained hard on it every day. Basically, the perfect teachers that worked right alongside their aquatic training teammates every day. Every Pokémon of Ash's had all picked up water training very well after much intensive practice and training. Even the 2 Butterfree, Beedrill, Pidgeotto and Fearow had all learned how to do it and was becoming better every day at it. It was extremely hard for them since they were in no way naturally made for the water but were determined to get it and trained every day as hard as they could to get better. They did eventually get better at it, much to Professor Oak's shock, and learned how to really move themselves in the water much more efficiently and also began using the flying motions and natural movements of their wings to move themselves even better in the water. They also, just like all of Ash's other Pokémon, had been learning how to hold their breath, dive and learn the ins and outs of underwater combat. Yet again, the Pokémon with wings just utilized the same method they naturally used when flying and tweaked it to move themselves above and below the water. They also had been training to use speed attacks like agility, quick attack and other such moves to make themselves faster and better in the water. Something that most water types couldn't do since most water Pokémon couldn't use speed attacks as powerful and efficiently as flying types could. This sort of offset the natural advantage that the water Pokémon had over the winged Pokémon. Ash's flying types still weren't as efficient in the water as his actual water Pokémon were, however, and that was only natural. One thing that they couldn't get past was the need for oxygen that required them to come up out of the water faster than a water Pokémon. Still, they and all of Ash's other Pokémon had made tremendous gains in aquatic maneuverability and combat. They were all slowly but surely becoming faster, more comfortable and more battle-oriented in the water as more time and practice rolled by. They were even trying to develop their own version of water attacks they could use while in the water. The winged Pokémon of Ash's had been trying to develop a method of using their wings to launch high-powered shots of water at their opponents and were also trying to work on physical, grappling-like combat using their mouths, wings and appendages to fight while in the water. Sort of like how the Sinnoh region's Staraptor used the same type of physical combat while in the air using a move called close combat. Needless to say, it was hard for Pidgeotto, Fearow, both Butterfree and Beedrill to learn how to fight in the water, but they were determined to do so. If they could learn how to fight and move on the land, then they could learn how to do the same in the water. It was this very determination that had excelled them in that goal so far, and now they were just trying to perfect and better their skills in the water. Both above and below. All of Ash's other Pokémon had this same determination for aquatic combat, but the winged Pokémon were very determined. Professor Oak honestly thought they were hoping to become better in the water than the water Pokémon themselves. They worked so hard. A goal that was very admirable, but one that Professor Oak knew was not going to be reached. It was astounding that all of Ash's Pokémon, especially his winged Pokémon, learned how to fight and swim above and below the water, but still, Every Pokémon was specifically made for some type of terrain, and water Pokémon were just that, made for the water. Other types of Pokémon were not. Especially flying types. It could be said that water was actually the natural enemy for most all bird Pokémon. Which was just another reason why Ash's winged Pokémon learning how to overcome that natural hurdle was so amazing. There were a few exceptions like the Hoenn region's flying-type Pokémon Wingull and its evolved form Pelipper, which were two birds that were part water-type and were more natural and comfortable in the water, but these birds were few and far between. However, Ash believed in all of his Pokémon no matter what they did. They all believed in themselves, and Professor Oak had even started believing in them. They knew they could accomplish their goals and even had the professor start attaching lighter weights than what they usually trained with to their body while they worked out in the water so they could get better and stronger faster. Another method of training Ash had told Professor Oak he was doing was something that frightened and dumbfounded the aged man. Ash said that he had taken to finally starting Squirtle, Bulbasaur and Charmander's type disadvantage training since they were now strong enough. He said that for this method of training he always had to be very prepared and have medical supplies on hand for his three Pokémon while they did this potentially very dangerous training. He worked Squirtle by having the water type stand still and then had Pikachu and Bulbasaur take turns blasting the turtle with moves like Thunderbolt, Razor Leaf, Vine Whip and Giga Drain. He said that Squirtle would have to just stand there and take the attacks for as long as he could, building his endurance to them, and then Ash would always step in and stop it so Squirtle didn't get too injured. Pikachu was different. Since Ash didn't have any Pokémon with him that knew moves Pikachu's type was weak against, he would just build Pikachu's resistance and durability to pain and attacks in general. He would have Pikachu stand still like Squirtle and then have Squirtle, Bulbasaur and Charmander attack the Yellow Mouse viciously with either physical moves or their individual attacks until Pikachu would collapse. Ash said that this method of training was hard to do for Pikachu because the small Pokémon had a problem of getting very possessed during the heat of battle. He was very much like his trainer and pushed himself to dangerous limits while training just to get better. Ash said that when Pikachu was exhausted during training he just went faster and harder until he collapsed, and when he was hurt in battle he just smiled and kept going. Ash explained how careful he had to be with this type of training for Pikachu since the Pokémon would most likely push himself to life-threatening levels in the pursuit of getting stronger. So the stand and take the pawn training Ash had Pikachu do was very monitored. The gain through pawn, as Ash called this, type disadvantage and pain tolerance training, was very tricky to use for Bulbasaur and Charmander. You see, the natural elements that those two Pokémon were weak to was not something to take lightly. The first thing to know is that there are technically two kinds of type disadvantages. The first type was the most common. This form of disadvantage was when one Pokémon's type and moves just were not as elementally strong as another Pokémon's moves and type. Like an electric type and a ground type. Unless a Pokémon was like Ash's Pikachu and could utilize focused lightning to smash boulders and crater the ground with just his electric attacks, most electric Pokémon were weak against ground-type Pokémon because their electric attacks don't conduct on the ground and always end up getting snuffed out, leaving them with only physical attacks. The ground-type Pokémon on the other hand has physical and elemental moves they can still use against the electric Pokémon, which makes them strong against electric-type Pokémon. However, their moves don't have the possibility of fatally wounding or killing an electric type unless they are attacking with the intent to kill. With Pokémon like grass and fire types, this isn't the case. Deadly type disadvantages is when one type of Pokémon has elemental moves that could easily wound severely or even kill the type of Pokémon they're strong against. For instance, in nature, fire burns foliage and green things like vegetation easily, while water completely quenches and destroys fire. The same rule applies with Pokémon. Charmander could use a flamethrower on Bulbasaur and, since he is a grass type, eventually burn Bulbasaur to nothing more than a crisp. Squirtle could fire a water pulse at Charmander's tail flame, completely extinguishing it and killing the fire type. This was what deadly type disadvantages was. Before Ash had Charmander start blasting Bulbasaur with fire, he first put his genius brain to the ultimate test and, over the 2 months that he and his friends had been at Hut Report, had come up with 2 absolutely revolutionary techniques for grass and fire-type Pokémon that Professor Oak knew would only serve to make the boys' Pokémon an absolute nightmare in battle to deal with. For Bulbasaur, Ash had started by explaining that all living beings are made up of mostly water. Fire is naturally null and void when it reaches water unless the amount is so small and the heat is so great that it evaporates the water. Very rare though. Ash theorized that if Bulbasaur could utilize the energy sapping and pulling effects of moves like his Giga Drain and turn the attack on himself, or more specifically, direct the attack inward, he could use the pulling effects of these moves to draw however much moisture he needed out of his body and make it form almost an armor or second skin of water over his body. Using this technique, Bulbasaur could use, say, Giga Drain, to draw moisture out of his body and form a layer of water over his form to protect himself from fire attacks. Also, since Bulbasaur's body controls the molecular structure of energy-stealing moves like Giga Drain and also the temperature of his own body, Ash hypothesized that Bulbasaur could probably regulate the temperature of the molecules that made up the water in his body by using the tendrils of energy that make up Giga Drain. As the tendrils pull the moisture out, Bulbasaur could focus all of his will into changing the temperature of the water molecules while they were infused with the tendrils of Giga Drain. Doing this, Bulbasaur could make the water armor around him as cold as he wanted to. Which in the long run would mean that the lower the temperature and the colder he makes the water armor, while still remaining in liquid form, the stronger and more resistant it would be against hot fire attacks. Since Bulbasaur could only ever pull out so much moisture from his body without killing himself by being too deprived of water in his body, he couldn't ever create a thick enough shield of water around his body to stand really hot fire attacks. That's why being able to regulate the temperature of the water armor through the use of Giga Drain was so important. Bulbasaur may not have quantity of water on his side, but if he could make the temperature of the water armor cold enough to withstand most fire attacks, he would be fine with just the amount of water he was able to safely draw from his body. The best part was, since Bulbasaur wasn't an ice-type Pokémon and couldn't freeze water, he wouldn't have to sorry about freezing his water armor, which would then be too cold and easy for fire to melt through. Ash had explained this to Bulbasaur very carefully and trained with him on it for the better part of those 2 months. He told Professor Oak that he wasn't expecting his theory to work and that Bulbasaur had literally shocked him one day during training when suddenly, after all of Bulbasaur's hard work that Ash was sure would be in vain, paid off in full. Bulbasaur found the perfect way of pulling out the moisture in his body with Giga Drain and formed the water armor around himself perfectly. He said that it was one of the most beautiful things he had ever seen and sort of reminded him of what a water Pokémon looked like when they were using the ability Torrent, when they were weak. Bulbasaur could maintain the water armor as long as he focused on it, and the only side effect of such a technique was how thirsty Bulbasaur was when he was done using it. After they actually worked the water armor into existence, Bulbasaur started working on regulating the temperature of it like Ash instructed. Yet again, it was hard, but Bulbasaur started to make very good progress with it. The only problem for right now that Bulbasaur had was that he couldn't move while using the water armor, since he had to focus so hard on maintaining it. This was what they were working on now. Having Bulbasaur be able to bring up, dispel and move around with the water armor much quicker. When Ash finally had Bulbasaur use this technique during his and Charmander's training, it worked perfectly. Bulbasaur brought up the armor of water around his body and then Charmander fired a powerful stream of flames straight at the grass type. When the fire made contact with the water shell, it just started turning to steam and evaporating, encasing Bulbasaur in a thick fog of mist. The temperature of the armor was perfect in keeping Bulbasaur safe from the fire while he still received the heated effects of the flames from within the armor so he could build more resistance to them. Ash then explained how he had helped Charmander Fire types like Charmander usually always had an external flame burning somewhere outside of their bodies that in some Pokémon's case, helped to regulate their internal body temperature. That's why if something happened to, say, a Charmander, Charmeleon or Charizard's tail flame and it was extinguished, they would die. They needed that source of flame as a regulator for their intense internal body heat. This way why Charmander, its evolutionary line and Pokémon like them were so afraid of water. They knew that if water touched their tail flame it would put it out, resulting in their deaths. Ash had thought long and hard about this. Studying Charmander and his anatomy intently and developing several different theories and ideas. Finally, he thought about something. Fire types could regulate the high temperatures in their bodies to either warm them up and or make their fire attacks weaker or stronger. So why couldn't they use that same control on the external flames that always burned on their bodies? Like how Chimchar in the Sinnoh region could extinguish its tail flame when it slept at night so it didn't risk burning its surroundings down. And just like that, Ash found the perfect way to make Charmander all but impervious to all forms of water attacks. He had explained to Charmander that if he could somehow focus on centering all of the heat and fire in his body to his central core and focus all of his will into making that core temperature as hot as he could, maybe he could temporarily extinguish his tail flame and withdraw the fire up into his core and focus on keeping it burning as hot as he can in there so his body temperature stays elevated and he doesn't have an open and exposed flame on the outside of his body that can be put out. This would leave no reason for Charmander to ever fear water attacks ever again as long as he battled water Pokémon with his tail flame extinguished and drawn up into his core. He could battle any Pokémon then without any fear whatsoever of ever having a type disadvantage of any kind. Be it a water or ground type Pokémon, it wouldn't matter. As long as he had no flame to be put out, he would be an open type Pokémon. And not just Charmander either, but any fire Pokémon he ever captured. If he could train them to retract their external flames into their bodies and keep their internal temperature as high as they needed to during a battle with a stronger type Pokémon, then all kinds of doors would be open for them. Of course, their flame attacks would still not have much effect on their type superiors, until they learn to elevate their body temperatures to such high degrees that the flames they expel can't be resisted by anything. However, if they could beef up their physical attacks to extreme levels, then they could still defeat their type superiors, with the type disadvantage null and void. Ash knew that if Charmander could get this technique down, then even Bulbasaur's water armor would pale in comparison. Even though Bulbasaur could become very resilient to fire attacks, he could still be affected by them. Charmander, on the other hand, he could become a complete, type superior, free Pokémon. Which was huge. After he explained to Charmander about trying this technique, the Pokémon was nervous about extinguishing its tail flame, but after Ash told him the benefits of such a technique and how to first start practicing by regulating his body temperature, Charmander was ready to begin and start the new training. The fire type took to the training like crazy and worked as hard as he possibly could. Getting the technique down and figuring out the method of it was extremely difficult for Charmander, and Ash wondered if it could even be done. He was pleasantly surprised, however, when one day while training Charmander's tail fire disappeared and he didn't drop over dead.